Hi, and welcome to Industry Night with me, Nycci Nellis. Welcome. Look, here I am at the gorgeous Wine Lair. This is the show that takes you on the deep dive into the happenings of the hospitality industry. Now, sometimes we talk about travel trends. Sometimes we talk about food. Sometimes we talk about wine. Sometimes we talk about culture. But it all comes back to the industry. Now, if it's your first time here, hello and welcome. A little background on me, who I am and what I do. So I've been covering the DC food, wine, and hospitality scene for the last 20 years. Chances are, if you live in the DC market, you've read the list, areyouonit.com, the online e-zine that tells you everything that's happening in the DC metro area. We have the only calendar of every food and wine event, festival, gala, you name it. It's in there. Every restaurant opening that is opening is in there, and every restaurant that is coming soon is coming in there. Also, I feel like I'm saying every a lot, but every single promotion that is happening around the DC metro area is there. So Valentine's Day, Dry January, restaurant weeks, whatever it is, we got you covered. Of course, you tune in every Sunday to Foodie and the Beast, 1500 with my husband David and I, 14 years on air. We've been married for a lot longer than that, 27. But you can check us out. It's the only food and wine variety show in the city, and we feature people from all over the world. It's always a ball, lots of drinks, lots of food, lots of fun. Of course, you follow me at NYCCINELLIS on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Twitter for the moment. It's probably going to be something else soon. But that'll keep you in touch with all my travels, because I have been traveling, and all my eating, because I eat a lot. And then, of course, here we are in the Wine Lair, this great, gorgeous private wine club next to the Ritz-Carlton here in Washington, D.C. And look at me. I'm so in my element, surrounded by fabulous wine bottles. Of course, there should be wine glasses in front of me as well, but not when I got a show to do. So for those of you who are watching us, hey, we're on YouTube now. It's so exciting. And for those of you who are listening, hey, but you can also watch us on YouTube. So please subscribe to both the podcast and us on YouTube. Okay, so let's talk about my week, because it's been fun. I got to look at my notes, because even though it's been 7 days since I was last here, I have really been out and about. So fabulous event at the Japanese embassy celebrating the food products and agriculture of Fukushima. Now, you may remember that Fukushima had the terrible nuclear accident because of the tsunami years and years and years ago in 2011, but they have done remarkable work to bring that prefecture back. So I got to learn a lot about the products that are coming out there, from sakes to rice to fish and cattle and etc. And it is an amazing, amazing story. I do hope that a trip to Japan is in my future because of it. Stop by Joy by 7 Reasons. It's sort of this new hot place that's happening in Chevy Chase. The 7 Reasons guys are very big right now. They've opened like 5 properties in the last few years. The food is good. Fair warning. The food is expensive, but I mean, a lot of restaurants are expensive. I feel like this one is a little bit higher for a casual restaurant, but it is hopping, great cocktails, a terrific wine list, and everything we had was really competent. I think it's finally a place in Chevy Chase that may stay in that location, because that location has turned over like 1,000 times. So I went to brunch at Teddy's and the Bully Bar, not Ted's Bulletin, not that there's anything wrong with it, but Teddy's Bully Bar. And I'm embarrassed to say that I'd never been there, given that it's been around for like 11 years. And that place is on fire for brunch, because they do bottomless brunch, but not just drinks, which I did not partake in, but they do bottomless food dishes. So the entire time, it's like a dim sum. They're just passing around food, really excellent options like waffles and fried chicken, these massive pancakes, healthier options too, like avocado toast. And it was just great. So if you're doing like a party for brunch, which is what I was there for, I would recommend it. Okay, very quickly, you know I'm a high tea person. I go as often as possible. I have a partner in crime with that. My daughter-in-law, Alyssa, and her sister, Erin, both join. We like to do it together all the time. If my daughter Tess is in town, she comes with. My son Sam was very upset that he wasn't a part of high tea, so he came too. So we did a fabulous high tea at the St. Regis. I'm really going to kind of award it at this moment one of the best high teas in the city. It's really refined. The teas are fabulous. They're from a French house. They're specifically made for this St. Regis. They have gorgeous tea sandwiches. You can get the Veuve Clicquot with it. I don't really understand why you would have champagne while you're drinking tea, but who am I to judge? And the scones are fabulous because to me, it's all about the clotted cream. Then I just came back from a little tour of the Shenandoah. So much is happening out there. It will all be on my social media shortly. Crimson Lane Vineyards is opening up. I got to spend some time with the winemaker and the couple who is opening up the property. It's going to be a must-hit spot when it opens up in March. And then I got to spend the night at Avoca Farms. Such a fabulous, gorgeous location. They are raising what is called F1 cattle. It's half Angus and half Wagyu. All the restaurants in DC are carrying it. It's a very high-end product. I got to sit with the farmer and the people who are raising these cows. I got to play with the cows in the field and learn so much. So I will be passing on all that knowledge to you. But now I want to get into today's show. So as you may remember, back in the fall, I was blessed by being asked to interview famed author and amazing storyteller Michael Twitty. It was on the main stage of the Capitol Jewish Museum Festival, and I did a whole industry night about it. So please take a look at past episodes. And while I was chatting with Michael, I met and began chatting with LaNitra Berger. So LaNitra is an associate professor of history and art history, and she's also the director of African and African American Studies at George Mason University. And she told me that she was doing a program with Lauren Strauss, who is also here with me, who is a senior professional lecturer, history department and Jewish studies program, and director of undergraduate studies, Jewish studies program at American University. So they're working on this program together about Jewish studies and Black studies. And I was like, I have got to learn more. Given what's happened in the world today, sort of pre-Kanye and now post-Ye and Dave Chappelle and all these things, there's so many ways that the Jewish and Black diasporas come together, even though sometimes we come apart. So I'm looking forward to learning more about it. And I want to thank you both for sitting here and listening to me talk about all the fun things that I'm eating and drinking. Right. Well, that is my job. Okay. So LaNitra, let's start with you. I'd love to learn a little bit about your background and how you got involved in this whole process.
Thank you so much, Nycci, for the invitation to join you and Lauren in this conversation. And I also want to thank Michael Twitty for bringing us together. He's such a convener and a connector, and this is just a really great outcome of that wonderful book presentation that he gave. So I am a professor of Black Studies at George Mason University, and that means that I have the pleasure of getting to do scholarship and teaching and research with colleagues and students about questions in the Black diaspora. And I have been interested in Black history since I was a young child. I grew up in San Bernardino, California, which is about an hour east of LA. And my mother was an antiquarian book dealer as just kind of a hobby. So she would go on weekends to thrift stores and she would be looking for rare books and she'd give me $1 and she'd say, here, get lost, buy some books on your own while I look for rare treasures. And she actually found some really rare examples of Black manuscripts. And she showed them to me and I started to look through them and I thought, wow, this is really interesting. But I never thought that that could be a career. So it took a long time for me to graduate high school and get to college and realize that, one, I could combine my interest in art history with my interest in Black history. So that's how I ended up in grad school and studying African American culture. And now in my role at George Mason, I get to share that passion for research with students. My work looks at the intersections of the Black and Jewish diasporas. So I'm looking at ways in which Black and Jewish artists came together to promote art through social activism. And I think that's a really good way to meet faculty in Judaic studies like Lauren, whose work is also very similar. So we've been working together for the past year or more, actually, to develop a course that would really highlight the important aspects of the Black-Jewish relationship for students. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how I got to where I am now, and how Lauren and I got a chance to start working together. And she'll probably tell you a little bit more about the person who really got us connected.
Great. Thank you so much, LaNitra. Okay, Lauren, so let's hear about your background a little bit and how you wound up where you are today. And then I do want to hear about how, because now we know Michael Twitty connected you and I, but how you both got connected.
Well, I'll answer that first. There's an amazing, also another connector. I also want to thank you for the invitation. This is great, adding another person to our circle. And a man named Alan Meltzer, who is a recent alum of American University. And he is an older student who went back to school later, and he's just interested in the world, and he is particularly passionate, among other things, about Blacks and Jews, their relationship. He's Jewish. His daughter's husband is African American, so that's one of the reasons. And he convened an incredible group of people who were all meeting on Zoom during COVID to talk about sort of what we can do, what we can bring to that issue. And he brought clergy people and heads of Jewish community centers, and we were among the few academics involved. And so we started talking about this class, and the class really grew out of that group.
Amazing.
Yeah.
But let's just back up a little bit to hear just sort of your journey to getting to here today.
Well, I grew up across the country from LaNitra, mostly in New Jersey, a few other places.
If you're on YouTube right now, you can see we both have big hair. Our Jersey roots run deep.
Right. Yes, very important. And I grew up in an activist Jewish youth movement called Young Judea, which is dedicated to Israel education, but also to pluralism and activism. And their theme really is about changing the world. And so I'm never content to just let situations remain as they are, really because I grew up being expected to be the one to change them. So as part of that, the rabbi in my synagogue, who was also involved with that movement, he's very famous. His name was Dr. Joachim Prinz, and he was a refugee from Nazi Germany. And as soon as he came to this country in the late 30s, he began to get very involved in the civil rights movement. He became very, very close friends with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he marched with him, and he actually gave a now well-known speech right before Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech on the National Mall. And in that speech, Dr. Prince talked about how the greatest crime is not abusing people, and he's referring to his experiences in Nazi Germany. The greatest crime, he said, is silence. And so that's really, I grew up with that as a major influence, and also my family. I come from a family of fairly recent immigrants from Eastern Europe. All of my grandparents were either born there, or one grandparent was born about a minute after her mother got here. And so they were fleeing pogroms, they were fleeing anti-Jewish violence there. And here they made their homes mostly in New York, a little bit in the Midwest, in Dayton. And they really focused on food, family, and community. And so I grew up really surrounded, and I think that that's something that we really have in common, that we've talked about, the idea of family and food and also a larger community really being something that both brings people together within their own community and also enables people to build bridges with others, even from very different communities, because you have those values. So I would say that that's what inspired me, and I have been teaching Jewish history and Jewish culture for a long time with a focus on political and cultural history.
Well, so what I really would like to get into is, let's talk about the bones of the program that you're doing together, because it has so many unique offerings. And I'd like to talk a little bit sort of about the two diasporas and sort of the cultural heritage of each and where they can and do intersect.
Sure. So as Lauren said, we were part of this larger group that met throughout the summer to talk about how could we bring Black and Jewish communities together in community and have opportunities for people to overlap through their religion, through food, through cultural outings. And so the class was one part of that group's conversation. So because Lauren and I teach at two different universities that are on two different schedules, we had a lot of challenges in trying to align the courses. So anybody who's from the DC area knows that traffic is a big thing and people really don't want to sit on the Beltway for a long time. So we couldn't have one class because the students live too far apart. So instead, what we decided to do was to each teach our own classes at our own universities. So our class was named the same, Blacks and Jews in America, but I was teaching students at the Fairfax campus of George Mason, and her students were at American University. Right. So we shared some aspects of our syllabus, and then we had several times throughout the semester when students had a chance to interact with each other. So my class was virtual and hers was in person, but we figured out how to make that kind of hybrid situation work. And so students had a chance to meet each other in a hybrid format. And then we did the outing to the Capital Jewish Food Festival, where people could go in person and also have that food experience where they could eat and sample Jewish food. And then we had a couple other meetings throughout the semester on Zoom. So the themes were similar. The underlying principle of the course was the same across the two classes, but because we each have different academic backgrounds, we had certain weeks that looked a little bit different from each other. Is that, what else would you add?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because I'd like to know more about like the focus, right? And about the diversity of the class and the interest of the students who were taking the class, and what you were hoping, both of you, they would leave with.
One of the interesting questions that I get frequently when I say that I teach Jewish studies, history, and literature is people say, do you ever have any non-Jewish students? And, I usually give a flippant answer, like I'm from New Jersey, so I'm sarcastic. Right. So, and I say, if you take a class in ancient Chinese history, do you have to be an ancient Chinese person to take that? I don't know why that's the assumption. It so happens that in this particular class, the majority of my students were graduate students. Mm-hmm. And although I obviously don't go around the class and say, are you Jewish? Are you Jewish? It was obvious from what people said, they self-identify. I went to Catholic school growing up or whatever. And so people were taking this particular class, in my case, as a part of their interest in American culture and also in minority group relations and also civil rights. Some people focused on the South, some didn't. I had several students who were doing the public history program at AU, and so I actually sent the students on their own time to both the Holocaust Museum in downtown Washington and also the African American History and Culture Museum. And so we talked a lot about not only the issues, but also presentation interpretation and how and interpretation. And so so people were really taking it as a reflection of their interest in larger American sort of group interactions.
Well, I think what's interesting, so when, the Capitol Jewish Museum came to me and we were talking, I was like, I'm sure people are like, another Jewish museum, because I think the Holocaust Museum is like, it's like a museum of Jews, but it's not. It's just about an atrocity and the history of it and obviously all the things that go with it. So I think with what you guys are doing, having a place where people can go to learn more about sort of what the Jewish history is in the city is going to be very interesting and an excellent addition to what you're both already doing.
Yeah, the class was really interesting to think about how we were going to teach it, because you can't assume that any one student's going to have a full background on Black history or on Jewish history. So you want to find a way to bring the students up to speed so that they have a working knowledge of the events that we're talking about. But at the same time, you want students to talk about issues and big questions and really wrestle with those big questions.
And what are those questions?
So some of those questions include, how did the Black Jewish Alliance evolve? How did it start and how did it evolve? In what ways did Black and Jewish people work together and collaborate? So that looks a lot of different ways. There's political alliances, there are cultural alliances. I was really pushing my students to question whether there really was an alliance. So are we really looking at individual people coming together, or are there really concerted efforts among social movements for people to overlap between the Black and Jewish communities? And I wanted to push them because I really wanted them to dive into the reading and really think about what the scholars were saying and think about how scholars are interacting with each other on these questions, and really start to see themselves as scholars and contributors on this subject as well. So undergraduate students tend to feel very uncomfortable in that space, but that's how we want them to start to evolve as they go through their undergraduate careers. And I didn't want them to just think that there was a triumphal narrative in Black-Jewish relations and that we had somehow reached a peak and that, yay, everything's great and we're finished. So I really wanted them to understand that there were a lot of nuances and points in which historians disagree about whether or not there really was as strong of alliance as we might think there was.
Well, I think, nuance is always a key word in these conversations, and uncomfortable is also a key word to me in this world of sort of like, woke and all, there's all these like terminologies used, which I think are inappropriate. I mean, if somebody's coming to the table because they want to understand better and they want to learn so that they can be more successful in their lives in engaging with people from different cultures, isn't that the whole point?
Yes, it is. And it's hard because people are also exposed to social media. And so they're using a lot of, whatever the trendy terms are. I was going to say that one of the challenges, as LaNitra pointed out, is giving people enough background, enough historical background, especially, to have a common vocabulary, and yet leave time for discussing these larger issues. So I think I approached my class more chronologically at first, starting by giving some of the background and so that we could have that framework to refer to. But one of the larger issues also for me, and I think your students as well, is the extent to which this is not only reflective of Blacks and Jews, the Black-Jewish relationship, and also, as a side issue here, we shouldn't even talk about them as always being separate communities,
right?
Because, as Michael Twitty and others demonstrate, there are also Jews of color, Black Jews,
and your children,
Jews of color, your children, and so that's a whole other issue. But talking about them as two communities, that's not the only sort of perspective that I wanted the students to have. It's also what this says about America and the larger society, and both the possibilities of, as I said before, minority group interaction, but also where someone is, where their group is on the scale of what's accepted in America is really reflective of the country's values at any particular time. And in many ways, certainly the Jewish story in America is one of kind of a sliding scale in terms of how Jews have been perceived racially, how they relate to other ethnicities. And this is, frankly, looking at Jews as an ethnicity and as a group with a heritage, not so much focusing on religious, on issues of faith or belief. And so through this, we're able to see that the way that Jews have been treated, perceived at different times, different junctures in American history, and also regionally in different places, sometimes usually actually not being seen as white, well into the 20th century, certainly at least until the 1930s, and then starting to kind of shift into this gray area of white ethnics. So where Greeks and Italians and Jews might fit in. And then only really the latter half of the 20th century being considered often white, except for Jews of color. That really says as much about America and its changing values as it does about, what the Jews themselves are trying to do. And then putting that in contrast to the Black story, where there hasn't been as much movement and as much agency in sort of deciding how you want to identify, is also really exposes deep racism and also, class division. So a lot about America as well.
Well, as we talked before the show about, how people identify themselves, I said I identify myself as Caucasian because that's how I think of myself. But you do not do that. But that is based on what we see in the mirror, whereas you have darker skin, you identify as Black, and that makes sense. But that changes perceptions, right? So we all have to deal with things in a very different way. And as we talked about yesterday, being in Israel. So in Israel, I assume most Jews do not identify as Caucasian because they're all the colors of the rainbow in the Middle East.
And the majority of Israel's Jewish population is from the Arab world, from the Middle East. They call them Mizrahi in Israel, either the Arab world or Persian or North African, or of course Ethiopian, from Ethiopia, from India. And so it's actually a minority, a bare minority, is so-called Ashkenazi with backgrounds in Eastern and Central Europe.
Here. I mean, it's what we know.
Here, that's the majority
in the States.
of American Jews. Yeah.
Right. So that's what, we're so laser focused on only what we see in front of us, not what else is over there until we get our eyes open. So what is your interest in these conversations, and what are some of the sort of trials that you take your students on, especially when we talk about cultural?
So I came into this subject as a young person, and I've only now as an adult had a chance to really reflect on how long I've been thinking about this subject. So my parents both came from the American South to California, escaping segregation and racism, and they lived in California because they wanted me to have a better life than they had in the South. And so over the years, as I was growing up, they would tell stories about some of the awful things that they experienced in Alabama, where my mother was from, or South Carolina, where my father was from. But the only times that they mentioned some really positive experiences about their childhood would be when they had interactions with Jewish people in the South. So my mother attended Tennessee State University in Nashville, and she studied math and science there. And she had the benefit of studying under the German Jewish refugee scholars who escaped Germany and came to teach at HBCUs. And she spoke so highly of those professors that she said, if you're ever in a place where you need help and there are no Black people around to help you, you should find a Jewish community because they have always been supportive of the Black community. As a child, it didn't quite resonate. I didn't quite put all those things together. But as I started to do my own research on Black culture, Black art, you always saw examples of Jewish connections to supporting the Black arts and helping to cultivate the Black arts.
As far as funding, or in what capacity?
Yes, so funding, philanthropy, patronage. In the case of someone like Jacob Lawrence, who's a very famous African-American painter, Edith Halpert was a Jewish woman who allowed him to exhibit in her gallery. So across the spectrum, where Black people were able to flourish in the arts, you often find that Jewish people are supportive in a variety of ways. And I noticed this pattern as I was beginning to write my dissertation. I thought back to what my mother said, and I thought, wow, there was something to what she was telling me. So I then started to explore this in another context in South Africa in a book that I wrote about a Jewish artist who painted Black women during apartheid. But in that case, it was very clear that the Jewish community was coalescing around questions of their own racial identity during apartheid, but also driven by a religious value to repair the world and to speak out against injustice. And I found that to be a really compelling story, and it paralleled what I had learned about my own parents' upbringing and my own observations in the United States. So I wanted to explore that question both as a researcher, but also to have students ask that question and explore that question, because I don't think it's one that we widely discuss in academia, but really give students a chance to understand some of the nuances that Lauren mentioned about identity and community and how people are not just one thing, they're not monolithic, they have multiple layered identities. And the more that we understand and respect that, the better we are as citizens, as professionals, as people who live in community with one another.
One of the things that I think is different in our experience teaching this is that I think in a lot of ways I would not feel as comfortable telling those stories as LaNitra is, because I'm sorry, that's because okay. For me, I don't stand in front of my class and say, hello, I'm Jewish, but it becomes fairly obvious. It might sound like apologetics if I only told them these positive, true stories, right, and manifold examples of Jews helping, Black artists and as educators, etc.
Well, but again, it's not Jews. It's Jews. I mean, it's people who happen to be
It's individuals,
Jewish. Right?
But they don't just happen to be Jewish. They are getting a message from growing up as Jews. They definitely are getting that message from their community, and whether it's morals and ethics or a historical consciousness of bearing the brunt of persecution elsewhere and not wanting that to happen to other people. So it is, of course, as individuals, but it also is a reflection of them being members of the community. I felt not really a burden, but I felt that it was a responsibility to also talk about less attractive, less positive examples of Black Jewish interaction and give sort of, a fuller-fledged picture of Jewish interaction with Black customers in changing neighborhoods in Brooklyn, point out that sometimes there were insensitive comments made by Jewish store owners or by Jewish union leaders, etc. On the other hand, I felt like I needed to inform the students about the mostly positive history, certainly, and not only the civil rights movement of the 60s, but also in the 30s and also earlier in the century, with the founding of the NAACP by many Jews and others, because the conversation has really turned, including in the American Jewish community, I would say, especially among younger people, to being very, very critical and only looking at the negatives and only, all of a sudden using words like white privilege to describe the Jewish community. And there's some of that. And there's also a lot of the positive. So I found myself in the classroom often feeling like I was balancing between, not wanting to appear partisan and apologist, but thinking, gosh, this class may be the only time and place that they are going to hear about all the positives as well.
That is really interesting. And I think about my own experience when you talk about that. And I think about my children's experience. The further and further we get away from the people who left one area to come here, it changes how connected you are, unless you're really looking to hear those stories. But I want to shift it a little bit because I want to talk a little bit, I want to dive a little bit deeper into the culture of the Black experience and the Jewish experience. We both celebrate in similar ways, and families, and we come to the table. And I'd like to talk about how that intersects in both the cultures.
So I love to eat, and I have fond memories of family meals. As I mentioned, my parents are from the South, so they love some Southern food. So grits, cornbread, fried chicken, collard greens, all those were part of our regular household menu. I had the benefit, though, of having grown up in California. My mother really absorbed Mexican food. So
Also delicious.
We'd have carne asada that was out of this world. And then she might, make fried chicken for Sunday dinner. And I just have so many memories of us having family dinners. So that was something that was always important to me to also bring when I had my own family. And my husband is Jewish, and his family came to the United States from Poland in the late 60s. So we have a Black Jewish household. We celebrate Shabbat on Fridays, and that's the one point in the week where we really come together for a family meal. So I found that I have a responsibility in a lot of ways to make sure that our children are exposed to Black and Jewish cultures, but most importantly, the food that's associated with those cultures, because that's where you have conversation and that's where you have connection. So I'll make, what would be considered traditional Southern food, but I'm also trying to step up my game as the wife of a Jewish man and make sure that I can cook a good brisket.
You made brisket. I was going to say.
That's right. I made the brisket, yes. And we have for many years had a Black Jewish Seder at Passover. So we have celebrated Passover with a family who since moved away. They were Jewish, so we would come together and we would always invite one non-Jewish family to come and experience our Black Jewish Seder. And we would use the Haggadah from the NAACP called The Common Road to Freedom, which is a really beautiful Haggadah that includes lots of references and passages to Black culture as well as Jewish culture, and our kids love it. They really enjoy it. So I point to that as one example of where we can merge the two cultures together and really talk about the history and the culture behind everything. But the meal is really centered around the food and the symbolism of the food. Mm-hmm. So we try to have a mixture of elements of Black culture in our Seder, but also elements of Jewish culture, of course, because it's Passover. So that's really where we try to bring everything together so that our kids understand that yes, they're Black, yes, they're Jewish, but there are also Black Jews. And what does that mean to embrace both?
Which I love, and I think I told both of you the story that when I was in Israel this summer, I met the Ethiopian community, and I had no idea of the Ethiopian story and of the Jews who were Ethiopian Jews who traveled from Ethiopia in the 80s to come to Israel. And, I think you said this earlier, but growing up in the States, growing up on the East Coast in the States as a Jew, you're really myopic. You're just myopic to all the other experiences that are out there as under the Jewish umbrella, because you think it's all New York.
Right.
Yeah,
my family certainly does.
Right. I mean, I know my family does. So,
Right.
So let's talk about you from the culture, also how you both bring that together with your class.
Right. Well, I think that one of the things we all have in common, besides curls, is we love food. Mm-hmm. I love food. Food is just central to everything. I just want to make one comment based on LaNitra talking about the Seder, though, that is, in general, the Passover Seder has for a long time been an area where Blacks and Jews and other communities can come together in a Jewish context. And right here in Washington, D.C., really one of the things that started that all off was in 1969, the Freedom Seder that was created by Arthur Wasco, now rabbi. No, he wasn't a rabbi at the time, and Reverend Channing Phillips, which met on April 4th, 1969, exactly a year to the day after Dr. King's assassination. And they re-edited the Passover Haggadah, the book that Jews use during a Seder, to reflect what they felt were the problems in the world at the time. So the modern plagues and racism, environmental degradation.
Well, it is a story of enslavement. So it
right.
It rings so true. Like I'm going to look that. I'm going to look up for. We call it a Haggadah.
Yeah.
I'm going to look that up.
Yeah.
I would totally use that at my Seder. It sounds fascinating.
Right. It is. So that has a long history. And the Freedom Seder will be covered, of course, in the Capitol Jewish Museum when it opens. So my family is very focused on food, the family I grew up on as well as now, less so on specific dishes, although I grew up with very traditional East European Jewish foods, some of which my children will not touch now, especially tongue.
Yeah, I won't touch tongue.
Yeah. And
but
stuffed
when
cabbage,
you're in the food industry,
right.
I got to tell you, when you're in the food industry, they want to throw offal at you all the time. If I tell you how many times a chef puts a plate in front of me and they're like, heart, and I'm like, I'm not doing that.
Right.
Anyway.
So I grew up with that and with kugel and things like that. But what I think I absorbed even more than the specific dishes was the idea that you should always have a lot of food, as if possible, and that your home should be able to absorb unexpected guests. And my mother was like that, is still like that. My grandmother, her mother was like that. I always wanted to be the house that could absorb either extra kids that my children brought home, or when I make Shabbat dinner, I always make way more than we expect to eat. And if they're leftovers, fine, I eat them during the week. But I want to be able to have that last minute family. So it's less the specific dishes, although I do love to cook and I cook a lot. I keep a kosher home, a fairly strictly kosher home, and we have a combination of carnivores and strict vegetarians in the house. So it's always right. But the idea is more about the quantity and the openness. And one of the things I love is when my kids, who aren't home now, when my kids would walk in on a Friday afternoon when I'm cooking something, and they would all say, it feels like a Friday afternoon. Mom's, getting ready for Shabbos. And so that's all about food and people.
Well, and I think you mentioned this about celebrating on Friday, Shabbat dinner, and bringing in the lights and doing all that. I think for people who, as I mentioned on that trip to Israel, and I was with a bunch of non-Jews, and we did a Shabbat. And actually, one of the things they did, but I thought was fascinating, is they had specifically the people who were not Jewish lead it. So they were told what the prayers were, and they said, don't worry, we'll say the prayers, but you say what you want to say as a blessing. So one of the women was a wine writer. You do the blessing over the wine. What is it that means something to you? And they did the same thing with the bread and sort of about the group being together. And it was a really powerful, powerful moment, because I think instead of looking at under a religious context, it was, oh, we're all gonna like have this meal together and we're gonna relax and we're gonna, welcome the night into the day. It was, it was a real moment. Yeah. And I think I don't think it has to be religious. I think everybody should want to break on Friday. You know what I mean?
Right, absolutely.
So now looking at this project that you two are doing together now, how does it culminate? What are next steps?
So I think we're still reflecting on how the class unfolded, but I would certainly love to teach the class again. Having learned a lot of lessons from the previous semester, I'd love to offer it more regularly so that more students have this opportunity. My leadership of the African and African American Studies program has been focused on creating more partnerships across disciplines and across cultures. And so I've fostered a relationship with our Judaic Studies program, which is new. We have a new minor and a new program. So we want to do more programs with both types of students. We're going to do a community Seder at the Jewish Community Center in March. And so I will bring some of the African American Studies students, both who took the class, but also others who are interested to that Seder. So really having people have a strong grounded foundation in African American studies, but to understand how it connects and intersects with all these other disciplines and programs. So we'd love to teach the class again. And I incorporate aspects of Black and Jewish identity into all of the courses that I teach. So I'm teaching Black Renaissance this semester, and we will talk about Julius Rosenwald and many of the other Black Jewish collaborations. And I'm working on a larger book project about how Black people see Jews through portraiture. So I'll be continuing my study of this subject from a research perspective, but teaching is what I love to do the most, because it really helps you to understand yourself as a scholar. And it's wonderful to see students making those connections. So really to get more students to have these hard conversations in the context of this course theme, that's what I'm planning on.
Before I hit you up, Lauren, I just want to ask, are you getting any pushback? Are you getting pushback from any of the students? Does anybody sort of challenge either of you really about whether Blacks have done certain things or Jews have done certain things? Is especially given the current climate, is there a lot of pushback?
So one of the hard conversations that we had in the class was a conversation about racial violence like lynching, and violence that was committed against Jewish people in the forms of either pogroms and the Holocaust. And I did my best at the beginning of the class to let the students know that we're not comparing here. We're not trying to say that one group's experience was better or worse than the other. And it was very challenging to keep students on task. And sometimes we did veer off track. And some of the students felt offended in some ways that maybe some of the Jewish students were implying that slavery was not as bad as the Holocaust.
It's not a competition.
Right. We were not competing. So trying to keep them on track was challenging, but was really important for us to keep the conversation moving forward. And I can tell just a quick story about how that really resolved itself when I showed a video. It was a news report about a Romanian village in which all the Jewish people had been murdered during the war. And we were watching the video, and at the end, one of the students in the class who was an older auditor student, he was visibly very upset and moved because he recognized the town as where his family had been from in Romania. Wow. And so I didn't know that in showing the video, but his just very visceral reaction really brought it home to the students that this is very recent history, that it's affecting individuals in the class, and that they are able to talk about this. And it really helps, especially the younger students, to see that this is not in the distant past and that there are people who are living with this trauma as we speak. Mm-hmm. And that helped us to kind of stay moving forward and not get into this competitive, situation between the two types of atrocities. But that was one situation in the class where it was really challenging as the instructor to keep everybody, in a productive conversation.
That makes a lot of sense. And what about for you?
I do plan to teach the course actually a year from now, next spring. And LaNitra and I talked about how to better deal with the logistical obstacles. So she's going to come visit as a guest speaker. And I think that I've realized that I'm including matters of race, racial identity in courses that I hadn't seen earlier, that issue could be relevant. I'm teaching a survey of modern Jewish civilization right now, and our next class, we're actually looking at two different articles about how Jews were viewed as non-white in revolutionary France, and how Enlightenment thinkers were very often very inconsistent in how they applied their enlightened ideas to Blacks in France and also to Jews. And so I wouldn't have necessarily thought about it in from a racial perspective earlier. So besides teaching this class again, in terms of scholarship in the wider community, in the wider world, something that I started talking to a couple of people about at the conference, the Jewish Studies conference LaNitra and I were both at in December, is that there is real interest in the scholarly community in doing more work. And I'm hoping to put together a scholars working group in the Washington area and maybe wider for us to have these conversations. And finally, I think that the campus climate and the climate in the country, unfortunately, has, aside from the Black-Jewish relationship and all kinds of sort of sensationalized things like Kanye/Ye and all of that, the rise in anti-Semitism in this country over the last decade, and the more open conversation about race, especially since George Floyd, has given rise to certain productive conversations about what anti-Semitism and racism have in common. There's an amazing article that I think we both assigned by Eric Ward about the linkages between anti-Semitism and racism and the role of white supremacy and all these other factors.
I think I read that article because it really basically says that white supremacy goes to pull communities apart so that they dislike each other, so that the white supremacy can rise, right? Because it's easy if there's fractions instead of working together.
So the moment of tension that LaNitra described in her class, that some people call the oppression Olympics, making it a competition.
There's no winner.
There's no winner. There's no winner.
Exactly.
So those kinds of realizations make it doubly important to learn about and respect each other's pain and each other's history, because that's the only way that we can overcome these things on the campus, increasingly on the campus and in the country in general. So I think that not only within the classroom, but the kind of dialogue and the kind of bonds that people have as a result, hopefully will go toward reducing the tensions and making people realize that something really productive can actually come out of this.
Well, I really hope so. And we're going to end on that note because I feel like we've had an amazing conversation. Lauren, can you please tell everybody where they can find you, either online or on Instagram, so that they can follow what you're doing?
I'm not really on social media much. I'm told that I should have an Instagram, and but I'm easily findable if you Google me, and you're welcome to email me also at AU.
Thanks. And I have a website, LaNitraBerger.com, where you can find both of my books. I'm also on Instagram at LaNitra Berger, Twitter at LaNitra Berger, and LinkedIn at LaNitra Walker Berger. So happy to connect.
Great. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank both of you for joining me today. These can be really uncomfortable conversations, but I think what you both have presented is that when you bring people to the table, whether you dress it with food or not, the more intellectual curiosity that people have about others, the better we can understand each other, work together, live together, not be in some sort of Olympics to find out whose ancestors were treated worse when, but instead look forward to have a healthier, happier community. So while this is not a traditional industry night show, I do think it was a really important conversation. And I want to thank you both for taking the time to sit with me today and have it. I learned so much, and I hope that our listeners and or viewers do too. Quick wrap up for the show. So I want to thank everybody for joining me today on Industry Night. I know it was a little different, but come on, you definitely learned something. Please check us out on YouTube, Industry Night with Nycci Nellis. You can subscribe. It's up and running. And of course, you can find us on every podcast, Spotify, Apple, whatever it is that's out there. Don't forget to check out the listareyounit.com, the online e-zine that tells you about everything happening in the DC metro area. Follow me at NYCCI, NELLIS on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter for the moment. And big thanks again to the Wine Lair peeps for keeping me running up here, and my great Heartcast Media guys who do all the hard work. And lastly, quick reminder out there, staff shortages are still real. So are supply shortages. Restaurants are a little pricier, but you know what? If you do go out, take your kindness pill. Remember, everybody wants you to have a good experience. I'm going to use that for restaurants and retail. Go to an airport, wherever you're dealing with customer service, when you're interfacing with people, take your kindness pill. Nobody wants you to have a bad experience. And enjoy what you're really trying to do. It's just no fun being angry. So thanks for joining me today. We'll see you next week.
Produced by Heartcast Media.